Howdy everyone. Welcome to another slightly randomly timed live stream. Today it's Saturday afternoon, so I guess maybe some of you will log in. I should probably try to nail down a time for these. Nevertheless, I'll go over some of what's recently been happening in the news, in particular Charlie Kirk being murdered, the protests that seemingly have erupted in Melbourne, Jacinta Nampijinpa Price being fired, and a treaty being forced upon us in Victoria. And of course, if you've got any thoughts about any of these, well, you can let me know that in the comments below. And I'll be trying to monitor those, although I'm not particularly good at these podcasts or streams, so I guess we'll see how that goes. Nevertheless, let's talk about some of the news. The first one I wanted to talk about is Charlie Kirk being murdered, well, assassinated really, in the United States. And this occurred at Utah Valley University, I believe it was called. Now, this of course occurred late last week, and of course it is a tragedy. It's interesting because in the wake of this, we did see some sections of the media effectively victim blame for him being murdered, effectively assert that it was his rhetoric or him daring to go and speak on college campuses that led to him being murdered. However, of course, that is a little bit disingenuous, given that, well, he was debating people, and that's a far cry from, well, actually being violent. And it was often talked about in some of the TikToks that I saw in the wake of this, that Charlie Kirk advocated for violence or similar things. But if you actually listen to a lot of what he said, or at least a lot of the clips I've seen, I don't recall him ever advocating for anything particularly violent. So I'm not sure that the victim blaming was really at all well-placed, if it ever could be. It appeared to be rather disingenuous and based upon a straw man or a caricature of what he actually stood for. Nevertheless, we saw some of that. We also saw some people fired for victim blaming him, such as one person whose name escapes me on MSNBC, who appeared to suggest that Charlie Kirk was pushing forward with violent thoughts and violent ideas, and therefore that can lead to violent actions. I think that, of course, is rather disingenuous because just debating people is A, not inherently violent, B, it is inherently protected in the United States, and C, I don't recall seeing a clip where he ever advocated for violence. It is, to some extent, a symptom or a function of a lot of the heated rhetoric on left side of the politics in particular, I think, and a lot of that leads to people feeling as if they are entitled to go and murder people for having contrary views. We saw this with, for example, Charlie Kirk, but also the CEO who was murdered in New York earlier on this year, or the assassination attempts against Donald Trump. Now, all of those are a dramatic escalation. Now, it's not as if the right side of politics has been completely non-violent. For example, there's been reports about some left-leaning lawmakers suffering violence in the United States, but nothing to nearly the same scale as we have seen here. For example, I don't think Cenk from the Young Turks seemingly has any imminent threats on him, and nor should he. But it does get at the idea that we seem to be getting people on the right being attacked much more prevalently. And I'm not going to lie here, the situation with Charlie Kirk, I mean, my channel is dramatically lower and has much less reach than he did, and I will likely never get to anywhere near the stage of status that he was. However, it does give, I think, a lot of us pause about really going public, whether it's myself or people like Daily Insight, or some of the perhaps more acerbic ones like Bearing, for example. It's an issue, particularly if you have a day job where you don't necessarily fear the CEO being a problem, and I personally don't fear anyone in the management team taking any issue with me politically. But the issue isn't the management team, it's people in bureaucracy or HR or colleagues who just happen to dislike you for whatever reason, who decide to lodge false or vexatious or frivolous complaints, leading to you being forced out. There was one example of this that was relatively high profile last year in Melbourne, where an academic was forced out from RMIT. He ultimately won in his Fair Work Commission appeal of this, and he ultimately left for Saudi Arabia, I recall. So you see people being effectively forced out by rather vitriolic individuals. So there's a short way of saying that the problems happening to Charlie Kirk are a very extreme example of concerns that many of the rest of us have. Now, there is, I guess, some good news, for want of a better word, or some less bad news, which is that it appears they have caught at least a suspect in this murder. Now, of course, whether he ultimately was the person, I'm not sure. I'm under the impression he might have actually admitted to the crime, although I will stand corrected on that. So in any case, this fellow is the one who is currently in custody. Now, again, innocent until proven guilty. I don't recall whether he's actually admitted it, but effectively, from what I can gather, from what President Trump said in, I believe it was Fox and Friends, he was recognized via the videos or the pictures. And then the person that recognized him got in contact with law enforcement, and the father worked with law enforcement to encourage him to turn himself in. That's my recollection of this. And again, my recollection of this is that he has admitted to it. But of course, I will stand corrected on that one if that's slightly incorrect. But that's my recollection. It appears he was motivated by very far left ideology. And the reason I say that is the shell casings that were left behind and some of the bullets had particularly pro-trans things inscribed into them, which implies to me that the assassination was due to Charlie Kirk's views on things such as trans issues. So it does kind of get at the idea that people escalated this much further. And I think that a lot of this comes down to people painting people like Charlie Kirk or Donald Trump as existential threats who want to throw trans people or other people into concentration camps or execute them. And I've heard this from people that I regard as otherwise rational and well-thinking, who seem to believe that places like Texas, and Charlie Kirk is not per se associated with Texas, I believe he was from Arizona, but places like Texas want to lock up and execute all LGBTQ people, not just trans people, but everyone, which I've heard that from people who are otherwise intelligent, people who are practicing fields, and I want to be careful with actually saying exactly what field they're in, but people in fields that this particular person that I'm thinking of, in a field that requires a lot of skills, education, and intelligence to ordinarily be operating in, who seems to genuinely believe that places like Texas are going to round up LGBTQ people, which I find astounding because it's simply not fact-based. But it appears there's a lot of non-fact-based things emerging in the media and on social media, and it becomes an echo chamber where someone says something and then they might have gotten that from somewhere that was completely haywire. But if that person who sounded reasonable then repeats it to someone else, they might be thinking, well, that person's intelligent, therefore they must be correct. But we seem to have this really odd situation of escalating echo chambers. Now, there are a couple of questions. First, I want to thank Steve for positive comments. I really appreciate it. And there was someone here asking what ethnicity I am. I guess I'm not sure exactly whether you're getting at nationality or ethnicity or how exactly you were defining that. But I'm from the UK and am white, so I'm not sure whether that answers your question. I mean, in reality, it probably doesn't make a ton of difference for this. I think there's a lot of people in this side, for want of a better word, more libertarian-leaning politics, who are from lots of different ethnicities or nationalities. For example, I have a couple of colleagues who are of Indian heritage and indeed moved to the United States from India, and they're very much Republican libertarian leaning people, as but an example. I have other colleagues who grew up in Australia but originally were born in Hong Kong, who are also quite libertarian leaning. So I guess you'll get people from a lot of different backgrounds, I think. And yes, the Union Jack is based on the flags of the UK, Ireland, and Scotland, which is correct, and it does raise the another question that I hadn't intended to talk about at the moment, but the reports about the St. George's Cross, I believe it was, being somewhat regarded as a bit of a hate symbol, which I find curious given that it is inherently part of the UK flag. But in any case, it appears that people are going to be misled into believing that what is one of the base elements is an inherent hate symbol. It would be like saying that the Southern Cross is a hate symbol. It makes no sense. Question is, am I British? I am a British citizen, yes. A British and an Australian citizen. So I have both, but I live in Australia. But yes, originally British. So I guess that helps. In terms of whether I'm from any of the people that make up the Union Jack, I'm guessing, I'm not totally sure what the question is, but I'm from England. So I'm not sure whether that answers the question. So I guess that would be people making up the Union Jack, I guess. So I was born in England, but have lived in Australia for most of my life. And my parents are Australian, so hence why I moved to Australia with them when they were moving back. But yes, so that is the Charlie Kirk killer. It seems like he will be prosecuted, at least unless it turns out this was a false confession or something along those lines, from what I can gather. Seems like he will be prosecuted. Donald Trump has called for the death penalty. I am under the impression it's going to become a federal crime and be prosecuted federally, which means the death penalty might be on the table. Whether or not they decide to go with the death penalty, I'm not sure. For example, say he confesses early and pleads guilty, hypothetically. The death penalty is traditionally would be less likely. And the reason for that is traditionally you want to give people credit for saving you the time, cost, and money of going to a full trial. And even if we believe that this individual, if he in fact did it, shouldn't be given that credit, you want to set the precedent for future cases that people who plead guilty are given some form of credit to encourage that type of thing occurring. Nonetheless, we'll see what happens at trial, which I assume is going to come up unless, of course, this fellow pleads guilty. And again, unless, of course, there is something that means that the person on the screen at the moment, Tyler Robinson, did not in fact do it. I'd seen some people who'd been mentioned before who were not actually the wrongdoer. But I guess we'll see. So that's the Charlie Kirk situation. I don't have a huge amount to add about that. I know a lot of people have talked about this. There's not much else I have to say other than it is, of course, a tragedy that should never have actually occurred. It's unfortunate because he was, I think, very helpful to the conservative side of politics. But there was an article recently in The Australian by Timothy Lynch, who is a professor at the University of Melbourne, who argued that Charlie Kirk actually helped progressives as well by forcing them to grapple with contrary arguments and think critically about what they're actually saying. So in fact was beneficial broadly, but I don't think the progressives seem to see it that way. So that's Charlie Kirk. Not much else to say about that other than it's not a great situation. The other update I wanted to go with is the protests, which I guess possibly relates to some of the comments I've seen coming in the chat. The protests were interesting. Apparently there were, the headline was cut off here. The Australian has a ton of ads at the moment, and I have an ad blocker, but it slows my internet down, so it's not great to have the ad blocker live while also doing doing this. Or it's not an ad blocker, a VPN that has some ad blocking in it. So it slows, Australian website grinds my computer to a halt at the moment. Like it soaks up all of the memory. It's terrible. But in any case, there's a headline here that's slightly cut off called Mass Protest Sweep don't know what Aussie was, including four in Melbourne. I'm going to say it's Aussie cities. The protests, there seemed to be 4 in Melbourne. It seemed we had the traditional pro-Palestine protest, which occur every weekend in Melbourne. There was a pro-Australia protest, or March for Australia style protest, that may or may not have been totally affiliated with the prior ones. There was an Indigenous sovereignty protest, and there was, I don't know what the 4th one was. The Australian didn't seem to mention that. In any case, there are a lot of protests. The numbers have been estimated as up to 5,000. Whether or not that's the case, I'm not totally sure, to be fair. But that's numbers that have been estimated. My particular favorite was on what is my right-hand side here that I'm attempting to point to, which is Anthony Albanese on a gigantic schlong, which I find hilarious. I'm sure that some people on the left will find that incredibly offensive. And I'm sure that someone will come out and say that offensive symbols have no place at these rallies. But I find that hilarious. And his head is on the head, which I think is appropriate. That's, I think, one of the funnier ones. But the protests appear to be a continuation of some of the ones from 2 weeks ago. The March for Australia ones possibly were enlivened by Jacinta and Nampijinpa Price being fired, and I'll get to that in a second. But that seemed to escalate them. There were apparently some scuffles. Whether there was really very much of that, I'm not sure, but it didn't seem to be hugely reported. Apparently, police needed to use pepper spray at one of the pro-Indigenous protests. Apparently, that's what I read anyway, but otherwise they seem to be mostly non-violent from what I can gather. There appeared to be little, if any, involvement from the National Socialist Network, again, from what I read. I think the protests have gotten less coverage this week than they did a couple of weeks ago, likely because the media's moved on to the next shiny object. And the protests have become so routine in Melbourne that in reality, well, they're protests. So I guess we'll see, but I suspect the protests won't actually change very much in Victoria in particular, because Victoria is pushing ahead regardless of what people want, with particular policies Jacinta Allen wants. At the federal level, Albo seems to be doing the same thing, and the Liberals seem to be relatively indifferent toward some of these protests as well. Nevertheless, we've got some protests going along at the moment. We'll see whether anything amounts from these. But like I said, they have been in some ways a little bit violent. So Chris has said that they were yelling hate at the cops, and it escalated from there. So in terms of the people yelling hate, it would be good to... which protest do you know was yelling hate? Was it the Indigenous one leading to the pepper spray, or one of the other ones? Because that was the only report of police getting involved that I saw. But again, I will stand corrected on that. And the media only started mentioning the cost of these protests once Australians started protesting, which seems absolutely right. Now, to be fair, I'm not sure that I really want to be paying for 4 protests every single weekend, but I was talking about the cost all the way back when we just had 1 protest. So, yeah, the media seems to talk about the costs when it suits it. They are expensive. Yeah, but I mean, if you're going to let one protest group do protests every single weekend and soak up many thousands of dollars, well, the other protests are just as entitled to do so. So I agree that the media calling that out now is disingenuous. If they were calling it out at the time of the Palestine protests, then sure, I get that. But if you're just calling it out now that there are protests you don't like, well then I think it says something about the people calling it out. Yeah, thanks Chris for clarifying. Yeah, the Indigenous one, it seems like it's interesting because the police, none of the protesters seem to be particularly fond of the police. Whether it's the pro-Australian protests that I think have muscle memory of the lockdowns, and while generally, I'd say generally collegial to the police, do remember the overreach that occurred. The pro-Indigenous protests appear to particularly be concerned about police violence, but a lot of that police violence is not necessarily in Melbourne or Canberra, but is in Alice Springs. And there is a question in some of those cases about the police, whether they were defending themselves and or whether the defense maybe went a little bit too far, but there was an element of self-defense in some of those. But yes. As Patriot Shield has mentioned, we know Palestine, we hear it every week, which is absolutely incorrect. Absolutely correct, sorry, I meant absolutely correct that it's every week. Indeed, sometimes not even on the weekends, as indicated by Bondi Beach, with the paddle out on Bondi Beach, which I'm sure achieved something. Yes. I don't have a lot to add about the protests. I would rather we didn't have protests every week. I understand the March for Australia protests and why many are protesting, but I guess it seems like those will continue for a little while. So yes, that's where we are at the moment in terms of the protests. And there was one here that said everyone needs to download the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, read the initial statement of intent. That is a good question. I have not actually downloaded that. It is something that I will put onto my reading list of things to do. But yes, that is the protests. Yeah, they seem like they're set to continue for a little while at the moment. Alrighty, so next thing I wanted to discuss, and I'm using PowerPoint to make this slightly less trash than it was last week, because last week I feel like it was just me waffling to a blank screen. So I'll probably do this. Let me see if I can pull up the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Don't know whether I'll be able to get that while I'm on the live stream. So UN Declaration of Human Rights. Let's see. I'll see if I can try to share screen on that. Alrighty, so I'm guessing it might be the preamble. And Chris, I was going to talk about Jacinta in just a second, so we'll get to that in a bit. It might be that I will need to read through this in full detail to get at the bit that you had mentioned. So I'm not sure whether it's in the preamble or initial statement. Find the PDF. Where is our PDF? I'm guessing text of the declaration. I'm guessing it might be that one. So where is the... I'm going to assume it's here. Where is the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all the members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. A couple of things that I probably want to mention here. It's interesting they talk about freedom here because if we think through to the lockdowns and the rhetoric associated with those, I do query how committed they are to freedom. Next one is whereas the disregard and contempt for human rights has resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom of fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. All right, so we've got a word salad there that needs some full stops at various points, and a sentence starting with whereas, which is always fun. But basically, the thing that is possibly worth highlighting, do I have a highlighter? I have a draw bit. Let's see. Maybe this is a highlighter. We'll see in a second. Freedom of speech is the interesting part there, because it does appear that there's been dovetailing into the Charlie Kirk situation, a move against freedom of speech being seen as a positive, which I think is inherent into that assassination attempt. Freedom of speech also seems to be only supported when it is freedom of speech of the correct side of politics, which I think is an interesting one. So that's the thing that really sticks out at me here, in that there appear to be a couple of statements in the first couple of paragraphs that are, I'm not sure that they necessarily adhere to their own ideals. And then, whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse, as at a last resort, to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. Again, getting at the idea that maybe we don't want activist judges, which admittedly is less of an issue in Australia generally. Although I do have some concerns about I think it was the NZQW, the lettuce salad judgment that resulted in the release of a large number of criminals. But regardless, I think that's an issue there. And then, whereas it is essential to promote the development of friendly relations between nations, blah, 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 blah. So it seems like possibly I have the wrong PDF. So I'll see if I can find it. So original UN Declaration of Human Rights. It might take me a little while to find this, so I might need to circle back around to this next time I do a live stream, as I feel like I'm probably going to be fishing for something that is going to be a little bit of a challenge to find. This might actually be it. Give them a... no, let me see. Chris, this is possibly showing my lack of ability to use this. I'm using OBS, so I don't seem to have a ability to do that. I'll possibly need to work out my technical lack of competence for next time, but I'll try to work that out. I'm not getting any ability to click to do anything there, so I'll need to work out what the situation is with that. So let's see. I think this might be the original PDF. So if there's a place that you particularly wanted to direct me to, let me know. I might need to try to zoom in. I think the first paragraph is very similar. So second one is similar-ish. A world where beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want. So again, the freedom of speech aspect here I think is important. And whereas it is essential if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights be protected by the rule of law. So start at the top. Up here. Approved by the UN General Assembly in Paris by 48-0. 8 countries abstained: USSR, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Saudi Arabia, and the Union of South Africa. The declaration is a statement of principles approved as a common standard of achievement for all peoples of all nations. It is not a treaty and therefore imposes no legal obligations. It is, however, a challenge to all mankind to promote worldwide respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. So far, it appears to be largely focused on freedom, which is interesting given that I think is ironic, given the lack of respect of freedom of speech in Australia and the United Kingdom at the moment, which tends to suggest to me they are departing, at least in spirit, from this, or rather picking and choosing the bits that they want to adhere to. The only thing, and Last Independent Thinker has said, the only thing missing out of that document is that you have the right to reside in your country under a system of government that there's nothing to make your ability to reside there become untenable, which is true. I mean, in reality, if you've got a country, the tricky bit with that, of course, is giving definition to what makes your ability to reside there become untenable. So I guess it's always a matter of what constitutes untenable. Is untenable, for example, a police state? Or is untenable, for example, removing freedom of speech? Is untenable violent actions against people for exercising freedom of speech? Is untenable not letting people go out during lockdowns via a curfew or sit in parks? And let's face it, Victoria went way overboard. Because, let's face it, the curfews were never evidence-based. It was ridiculous. Or is also it pertaining to freedom in terms of ability to afford to live in your home country. So I think that's an issue there as well. And last independent thinker, I think I'll probably need to sort of read through some of this in more detail as well, because showing my lack of reading of this, I've not read through the full statement in detail. Probably something that I will need to put onto my homework to do. But yeah, I think it's interesting in any case. My observation is there's a spirit of freedom and freedom of speech, at least at the beginning, that it appears a number of the countries have willfully departed from, unfortunately. But yes, I'll have to do some circling back around to that in order to perhaps do my own homework on the details of it. But it does, however, circle me back around to Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, which, let's see if I can go back to that. Because Jacinta Nampijinpa Price is an interesting person. Well, there we go, it's now stuck. Interesting person who was recently fired from junior cabinet. Or a junior ministry, sorry. So she was I'm getting the title slightly wrong, but the Minister for Defence Personnel, which actually, the media sometimes talks about that as being junior or a demotion or not particularly spectacular. I don't actually think that's a terrible portfolio, particularly when the only major portfolio I've held is Indigenous Affairs, and she did, I think, need to broaden her knowledge base if she were to become a future leader. And I don't think you jump immediately to defense minister or shadow defense minister, nor would you jump immediately to shadow treasurer, i.e. you need to build up a skill base, not necessarily waiting your time, but you need to have demonstrated a skill base to be able to do that. And as far as I'm aware, Jacinta Nampijinpa Price has no background in defense historically, so therefore for her to take on a defense ministry, she would need to build up at least some expertise and experience in the area. Similarly, as far as I'm aware, she doesn't have a treasury or economics or finance background, so therefore similarly she should pick up experience before becoming shadow treasurer. Now, that doesn't necessarily stop people like Jim Chalmers taking on treasury despite having zero real-world experience, or people like Dan Molino being in that portfolio as well despite the lack of experience. But I think it was still an important portfolio. Now, in terms of Jacinta being fired, she was basically fired for her statements on immigration, but the catalyst was her decision to not fully and wholeheartedly support Susan Lee as leader. And there's probably a few things to unpack this, and I talked about this in a prior video, but basically there's a couple of parts to this. The first one is failing to back Susan Lee as leader. I think that was a massive own goal, in that, say you are in shadow cabinet, even if you are mounting a coup, even if you are just about to get rid of the leader, you still need to publicly say you support them. Otherwise, it creates a lot of chaos. And the problem with that is that if you create chaos going for months before the coup, it makes the coup significantly less effective about getting its own runs on the board afterwards. Furthermore, let's face it, if she's effectively going to be in like a junior C-suite position in, to use a corporate analogy, you do kind of need to at least publicly support your leader, at least until the time that you don't. So I think Susan Lee had very little choice after that catalyst to dismiss Jacinta Nampijinpa Price. I just don't think there was much choice there. Now, that's separate from, to note Chris's comment here, that Susan Lee is Labour light. That's separate from me necessarily endorsing or particularly liking Susan Lee, but I think she had no choice in that scenario. Otherwise, she would be seen as a lame duck, and she would really have a lack of cut-through. Now, in terms of Susan Lee's policies, the problem I see with it, and it's a continuation of Peter Dutton, the problem I see is just dithering and prevarication. Now, it could be her policies end up being trash, but the problem is the policies are so vague and wishy-washy and non-existent that articulating a case, a compelling opposition, is nigh impossible, right? In that, where do they stand on net zero, other than not wanting to talk about it? Where do they really stand on Treasury-related matters? And to be clear, I think Ted O'Brien is actually quite good on that, even though I don't think he's very charismatic. I think he's doing an okay job, despite him being from the so-called moderate wing of the Liberals, at least having listened to what he's said. But the leader really does dictate the tone. So if the leader wants to prevaricate, wants to sit in a policy-free zone, there's not much you can do as shadow treasurer, because you can't really go and freelance on your own, because you will effectively be dismissed and sidelined. So it is a big issue that she faces. There's just not much of a policy platform, and therefore we end up focusing on things like Jacinta Nampijinpa Price's immigration comments for a week before she ultimately ends up being dismissed. Something that possibly could have been put to bed if they had better policy. The next issue is Jacinta Nampijinpa Price's immigration comments. And I think there were a few comments, and those comments all, I think, need to be treated slightly separately. The two main ones were a comment about mass immigration and a comment about Indian immigration. Now, the mass immigration one, how will I phrase this? I'm not the most fond of using the word mass immigration because I think it needs to be defined more clearly, because the words mass immigration can take on whatever meaning the person wants them to mean. I.e., when you say mass immigration, you open yourself up to Labour or the left painting you as xenophobic and disliking immigration of a particular background or whatever the case might be. You really open yourself up when you use the term mass immigration. And it sounds, how will I phrase this? It almost sounds as a pejorative to immigration per se. So the phraseology I am not the biggest fan of. Nomenclature aside, I think her point was that she wants a reduction in immigration numbers. Again, I think more detail is needed, but you kind of need a neat, catchy headline to actually carry the argument. So if you're explaining, you're losing, I guess. So you do need an actual headline. But the actual numbers really depend on the category of immigration, right? So there's differences between tourism, which is not really immigration, that's just temporary. I think tourism, most people aren't super concerned about. That's not really in the headlines. Then there's international students. Then there's permanent residency for skilled things, where the employer says that they've been unable to find someone locally to do the job. Sometimes it's a sham when they say that, sometimes it's not. Then you've got various other temporary work rights visas, lots of different categories, which all have different implications for production in Australia and different implications for housing demand and the like. So there's a whole lot of different aspects to that that I think go into the numbers. So I think it really is, you need to nail down what the specifics are if you're going to talk about immigration numbers as a politician. And politicians need to be more careful and circumspect than the rest of us, right? In that if you're a politician and you say you want to reduce immigration numbers, you need to at least be able to articulate where you're reducing them. So I think she could have been more careful. That I don't think is necessarily a firing offense, but she does need to be more careful in her language. The next one was about Indian immigration. And here I think she kicked an own goal, because it is factually correct that there's a lot of Indian immigration. It's also seemingly correct that the majority of Indian immigrants vote for Labour, at least according to Cos Samaras, who said that about 85%, according to his polling, of Indian immigrants vote for Labour, and he is of a Labour background, so it's not as if he is saying that to disparage Indians. It seems like he is actually saying that in a fact-based type way. He seems to be quite good as a pollster. So she connected those two comments and then went the next step of implying that Labour was importing people from India in order to bolster its numbers. And that implication has a couple of problems. Firstly, it sounds insulting to Indian immigrants, i.e., it sounds like the Indian immigrants are just being brought over here to gerrymander rather than adding something to the Australian community. And people might have a problem with immigration, but as a politician, and she's a politician, you have to avoid alienating a whole group of people. And there are ways of saying things, and saying things in a way that makes it sound like potentially, or could be painted as, all Indian immigrants are just labor plants, I think was not the smartest idea. It definitely was very clumsy. As Jacinta Nampijinpa Price herself said. And it opened herself up to being portrayed as racist, which the media who does not like her decided to do. Now, I find it a little bit odd that she would be racist. I don't believe she is racist at all. So I think the aspersions were wrong, but it opened herself up to those attacks. And probably she needed to put it to bed easier or earlier with not necessarily an abject apology, but a statement that highlighted why she acknowledged Indian immigrants in particular being concerned. And there are ways of apologizing. Donald Trump has like a never apologize, never back down approach, which works in many cases, but doesn't always work. So I think her phraseology was clumsy. I think she needs to be more tactful in politics. But that's my thought about Jacinta Nampijinpa Price being dismissed. I think it was inevitable when she didn't back Susan Lee as leader. That said, I think she has a huge amount of cut through to a good portion of the Liberal Party or potential Liberal Party base. Maybe people who are voting One Nation now, I think she has a lot of cut through for, which I think is something that the Liberal Party really needs to try to encourage and support rather than being Labour light as before. Now, there are a couple of comments that came through, and I may or may not have missed some. But Chris said he lost his career of 31 years because of immigrants conspiring to replace me with their friends. Now, I guess, how will I phrase this? I can empathize with where Chris is coming from here. The big problem with a lot of corporations, and whether it's immigrants or non-immigrants or whoever it is, conspiring to get rid of you, because in big corporations, they can lodge false or vexatious complaints. And those complaints you often don't have the right of reply to. So I don't know what happened specifically in Chris's case, but when someone complains to HR, you're typically not given the right of reply. Basically, HR takes a log of this, and then when there's enough complaints, they move. Now, those complaints might be completely unjustified. They might be completely one-sided. Maybe there was a grain of truth in them, but it completely misses the context. Regardless, you get these complaints that end up with you getting fired. Now, that can occur, I think, whether it's an immigrant or someone who was born here, but it is a big issue. And indeed, people might try to conspire against you to replace you with their friends or to just get rid of you because they don't happen to like you. It's a massive problem. I think the only way around that maybe is the Fair Work Commission, maybe. Because then if you're fired and it's unjustified, and let's face it, companies can justify anything these days, you maybe have some recourse. But in reality, often the problem that I see is there's a lot of discretion about whether or not to dismiss someone. For example, things that other people can do and be perfectly okay and everyone knows they're doing it might be perfectly fine for that person, albeit technically slightly outside of the rules. So maybe someone has a side hustle that they don't disclose and it's fine for one person but not for another. And then they use that to fire you. That's an example of one that can occur. Or another example that I know of that occurred with someone who's not a colleague, but I know that person. During the pandemic, i.e. notably when everyone was working from home and during lockdown. This fellow was working from Melbourne with his then girlfriend. I don't know whether they're still together. I'm not that close to the person. But in any case, was working from Melbourne. Now, technically, that person wasn't supposed to do so, but he was still doing his job. Literally everyone was working from home. So it made zero difference because no one was showing up in the office because, well, it was lockdowns and the like. That was used as part of the reason to get rid of this person. So there's a lot of discretion about what people do and don't use for a dismissal. I think that's a big problem that can give rise to the situation that Chris has experienced here. I think it's a big problem. Chris says Labour knows most people won't vote for them, so they fly them in and give them residency ASAP. I feel like there's a good, how will I phrase this? I guess I'm not a politician, so I don't need to be as careful as Jacinta. But basically, I can definitely, I'm not surprised that is happening. Let's face it, Labour politicians show up to every citizenship ceremony for a reason. I think we can see that. And you can calibrate immigration rules to be of particular categories if you particularly want something to occur. Furthermore, you can structure policies if you want a particular group to vote for you, such as the obviously absurd idea of getting people from India to build 1 million homes in Australia. It won't happen. Apparently it's to be funded by the UAE for reasons that completely escape me. Like, why is the UAE funding homes being built? The UAE might invest in homes, but they're not going to fund them out of, like, charity. Like, it's absurd. But in any case, you end up with policies like what Labour does that might be trying to corral support. The last independent thinker said Jacinta should just join One Nation. A political party is just a vehicle for you to get from A to B in your political career. And I think policy-wise, Jacinta is probably closer to One Nation. I think the reason she hasn't is because, at least at the moment, One Nation doesn't appear like it's going to form government. That said, things can change. Like Reform in the UK seems to be doing a better job than the Conservatives. So if the Liberals keep going the way they're going, they will potentially end up finding themselves in a serious challenge from One Nation. J11 says Lee might as well stay at home and tend to the farm. I guess it's possible. I want to give her the benefit of the doubt for what her policies end up being, but I'm not. How will I phrase this? I want to give her a chance, but I'm not optimistic. is what I would say. You never know. She might come out and surprise me, and she might come out and be a good leader. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Apparently, she's recently decided to give backbenchers more policy input into the platform, possibly to try to head off Jacinta going on her own policy adventure. So maybe she'll try to move things in the right direction. Like I said, not optimistic though. And Chris said, still many people working from home. Absolutely right. Lots of people working from home. I, to be fair, actually work from home not infrequently. Mainly because in my job, a lot of the people I work with more closely are actually overseas or in different cities. So in reality, I don't really work with people in my office that closely. So there's not actually a huge amount of benefit being there when the people I'm working with are actually in different countries or in different cities. Like I'm in Sydney, and if I'm working with people in Brisbane, well, I mean, it kind of is what it is, I guess. And Michael said Lee has no gravitas and no message. Now, I think I empathize with that, in that her message is very muddled. And like I've said, she dithers a lot. I think she inherited that from Peter Dutton, whose big problem I thought was dithering and failing to have a coherent policy. And I'll give you an example. And I've mentioned this before. When Labour came out and said they were cutting the lowest marginal tax rates, Dutton should not have opposed that and then come up with some not nonsense, but very non-convincing a non-interesting policy to cut the fuel excise. He should have said, Labour hasn't gone far enough and we're going to index tax brackets. Now, there might be an issue with the initial budget hit that will take, but he could have just said he'll do that. And let's face it, people aren't going to look at the details of the initial budget hit. They'll just see indexing tax brackets equals good. And he could have said that it'll be pro-growth, but he didn't. He's dropped the ball. And Susan Lee, I think, is doing the same thing. And she also isn't very good at carrying a message. I don't think Ted O'Brien, her deputy, is great at that either, to be fair. Neither was Angus Taylor. So they need someone who can actually carry a message. I think Tim Wilson is probably the best at that. He's clearly the most coherent of all of them. Whether he stands a chance of ever being Prime Minister is another question, but he's at least more coherent, he at least articulates his message better. But yes, that's Jacinta Nampijinpa Price. We'll see whether or not she becomes a thorn in the side of the Liberals, or what happens from there anyway. And I guess the final story I want to talk about before I let everyone head off to, well, in Sydney it's nearly dinner time, I guess, but before I let everyone head off and before I head off myself, I guess, is the Victorian Treaty. Talked about this in a prior video. Victoria is obviously just ignoring its own voters, which is, I think, clear already. Jacinta Allen decided to push ahead with the treaty regardless. About 55% of Victorians voted against the voice, and I would therefore think that at least as many would vote against a treaty, especially if they have to pay for it themselves. Now, the big problem here is the cost. $70 million per year. Oh, typo. Anyway, at least $70 million per year. Now, I say at least because the figures we don't know yet. And it can't expand because they can take money from general revenue or whatever, if there's spare money left over. And there is never spare money because Victoria is running at a deficit and is basically bankrupt. But in any case, the cost is at least $70 million per year. Now, Jacinta Allen's going to spin this as it being just paid for by property taxes or other levies against people that are a minority of people, which is how she gets away with this. And therefore why people don't realize they're implicitly paying for it. Because let's face it, business is either A, leaving Victoria, or B, and we need to think about this on a flow basis, business is not setting up in Victoria. So even if a factory is stuck in Victoria now, no new factories are going to move to Victoria, which means relative to what they could have been, they're having less business. And therefore, when you have less business, you have less taxes and employment coming through. If there's fewer people paying payroll tax, you get less payroll tax. And the way they resolve this is by increasing the payroll tax percentage, but then people don't set up businesses and you end up in a death spiral because companies leave Victoria or don't set up, so you end up having to increase your payroll tax rate, and then for businesses don't set up. It's baffling to me that they can't think in a multi-period framework here. Like, it's just like, oh, at time zero right now, is our budget going to balance? Which is obviously stupid, because then trying to make that result is going to cause you to, say, hike payroll tax or create the emergency services levy or hike land taxes, resulting in less tax revenue next year and the year after as people or businesses leave. I mean, it's something that is so amateurish at a policy level, but something that they can get away with. And the Liberals let them get away with it because the Liberals seem to be also prone to this amateurish approach, which is where they need the budget to balance right now rather than looking at future growth to cause the budget to balance in a couple of years' time, and then everyone ends up being better off. It's baffling to me that Liberals don't call this out at state or federal level, and Labour seems to just get away with it. It's terrible. But in any case, another $70 million per year, which is implicit reparations, let's face it, because it's $70 million per year being spent on this bureaucracy. Now, you don't need to explicitly say reparations for a portion of GDP effectively to be tithed away, or in this case, gross state product. Now, it gives us an idea of what would have happened at federal level as well. Implicit reparations. And Jacinta Allen has said, oh, the Liberals better not spread misinformation about this. And then she'll say if there's reparations, it's misinformation. No, there's money being spent. Just because it's not called reparations doesn't mean that it is not. But anyway, and there's also a bloated bureaucracy of 3 bodies, only one of which I can pronounce, which is the First Nations Assembly, which is the main body. It's an elected body, elected by Aboriginal Australians, which, ironically enough, the body itself defines who is an Aboriginal Australian. So that's an interesting one. It would be like Parliament being able to say on a whim who can vote. Now, technically, you can have voting rules, but you don't change those on a whim. It's similarly here. But the problem is, because it's a bureaucratic organization that is really not very accountable, especially not accountable to people that can't vote for it, it has a vested interest in changing the definition to benefit itself. I think that's very clear from it. It has other functions, which include making representations in inverted commas and advice to ministers and bureaucrats. And again, you'll get, I don't know whether they believe they're gaslighting. Are they really this stupid? Or are they just lying to us? But they'll say that it's just providing advice to, in this case, the state government or to bureaucrats. But it clearly isn't, because they're the only group that has funding and direct access that is guaranteed, in this case by legislation. That's clearly power. But what, yeah, I mean, it's, and then she'll gaslight us by saying it's purely advisory, like Albo did. It's obviously gaslighting, obviously lying through omission. I mean, it's clear that it's an entity that has actual power to influence bureaucrats, because they can launch inquiries into what bureaucrats are doing, and no prizes for guessing what the inquiries are going to be and against whom they are going to be. I think it's obvious how it is going to be used, i.e., if you don't bring acknowledgement of country throughout everything, you're going to be subject to an inquiry. And we know the inquiry is going to be a star chamber. Like, we know that there's zero right of reply to this. There's no real rule of law behind these inquiries. There's no real way to appeal it. So say an inquiry just strings you up. How do you appeal that? Like, how do you protect yourself against it? Then we have its ability to engage in place naming, which I guess that's a very Victorian thing to do. So changing location names or new location names, engage in so-called truth-telling, and let's face it, it won't be the objective truth. It could easily be a version of quote-unquote my truth rather than the truth. There's only one objective truth, and there might be different perspectives on what the facts underlying that mean. So we all know what truth-telling is going to involve. And then it can enter into additional agreements, which effectively can involve further treaties or a push for reparations or various other things that are clearly going to be a massive problem, and they could advise other state organizations. So I'll give you an example of where this might head that I don't think is far-fetched or fanciful. Universities could end up going and doing micro-treaties. Now, we've already heard reports from Macquarie University about forced acknowledgement of countries in students for an assessment. Monash has various Indigenous reports, not courses or reports, like trainings people need to do, reportedly. Reportedly, UNSW is trying to do its own, what they call a micro-treaty, for reasons that escape me. I'm going to assume it is because one of the leading voice proponents is in the executive there, and therefore she is pushing for it. That's my assumption, although I have no information either way about that. That's what I'm guessing. And why they're doing that is beyond me, because there's no obligation to do so. And therefore, if you're a university that talks about financial issues and concerns, and you create another bureaucracy that, say it's a university, it won't cost 70 million for a university, but like it'll cost you a good $1 million plus, at least, right? Because you'll end up with a person who needs to lead that bureaucracy, plus some administrative stuff. All of a sudden, you're up at like $1 million a year. And all of those $1 million a year adds up. So it just exacerbates a potential deficit. But worse than that, it will be an organization you can't cut in a downturn. Like you can cut language courses at ANU, it appears, which, rightly or wrongly, having a language course I think is useful because, I mean, at least they're teaching something that is useful, right? But, I mean, let's face it. Say, for example, someone is learning Mandarin. That can be a useful skill to learn. At least a language course is useful, but cutting language departments, well, admittedly, ANU is not doing this, but while also creating something that bakes in a structural deficit or the risk thereof that you cannot remove, is a huge risk management problem. It becomes incredibly expensive, but I guess that's where states are heading, and it appears state-based organizations might also be heading. And a comment here is, if you add up all of the money dedicated to Aboriginal programs over the years, any justifiable reparation account was reconciled a long time ago. Now it's all just pure grift. And indeed, I would hazard a guess that might in fact be the case. If we add up a lot of the expenditure, there's already been implicit reparations. There's already been implicit attempts to try to improve quality of life of Aboriginal Australians, whether it be improved healthcare, improved rule of law, and let's face it, Aboriginal Australians can benefit from improved policing and rule of law because I mentioned in a prior video there were cases where Aboriginal women were grossly mistreated by some Aboriginal men, and clearly there are many Aboriginal men who are not going to do anything illegal and are perfectly great people, but it's like a minority of people that engage in violent actions and then pretend that it's because of a customary law or traditional law. And having a legal system that protects Aboriginal women from that, I think, is vitally important. The rule of law helps people, and I think has helped many people from Indigenous communities. But I think that people tend to gloss over that. And Chris has said they say we're descended from convicts. The only problem that they're descended from prison guards as well, and they stayed, and that's correct. And a lot of them entered politics. Again, correct. The prison guards are the problem. Although, ironically, mentioning what Chris has said here, and Jacinta Nampijinpa Price said this, a lot of the convicts came over here for relatively menial crimes or minor crimes, and effectively were like slaves. Let's face it, they kind of were used as slaves for many things. So you do wonder, for some people descended from those convicts, were they also entitled to reparations for implicitly being used as slaves? Something that, if we're going to be talking about reparations, is also a discussion to be had. I think that is important, because let's face it, the convicts were brought over here on slightly shoddy conditions, and many were sentenced for very minor crimes, things that now would not even be prosecuted at all, like stealing loaves of bread and the like, and then effectively became slaves. Maybe that's something that we need to consider. But I feel like is not part of this discussion. Anyway, that was the last major piece of news that I wanted to discuss from the last couple of weeks. I will try to do another live stream next week or the week after. We'll see how it goes. I'll try to be a little bit more consistent. I haven't quite nailed down a time that is consistently going to work, because a lot of my evenings have random work-related things, and weekends, and this is a topic for another time, but weekends I often spend those looking at various properties because I find that entertaining to do. So we'll see, but I'll try to get a consistent time. Anyway, I should probably leave it here, given that it's 7:30 p.m. over in Sydney. I might go and try to find something exciting to eat for dinner. Probably won't, but we'll see. I should let you all get on with the rest of your weekends. But thank you everyone for coming along, and hopefully I will see you for the next live stream, whenever that happens to end up being. But thanks anyway, and I'll see you next time.